Welcome back to Joy Recovery Radio, where we're dedicated to helping couples find healing and hope after sexual infidelity and betrayal trauma. We share real stories, practical strategies, and deep insights to support you on both sides of this difficult journey. We truly believe this message can change lives, and you can help us reach more people by engaging with our content. Wherever you listen, on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or YouTube, please hit that follow or subscribe button. A quick like and a 5-star review also goes a long way, helping others discover our community when they need it most. Let's dive into today's episode.
Chances are those of you who are in the meeting live right now or listening later, you're walking through the devastation of sexual betrayal, sex addiction. Perhaps you're the one who has betrayed your partner, or you may be the one who has been betrayed. Either way, we both know recovery is hard, it's messy, it's often filled with overwhelming emotions, especially fear, anxiety, and anger. You could call it a storm. And one of the most powerful gifts that you can give in the midst of that storm is what we're going to talk about today. Learning how to become a non-anxious presence, even in the midst of a storm. Now, that may sound lofty, perhaps even impossible. But by the end of our time, I think you'll see how both my two favorite fields of study, behavioral science and Scripture, point in the same direction, as they more often than not do. But perhaps even more importantly, how you can start practicing being a non-anxious presence in the chaos of recovery. Let's go back to 1997. There's a number of things that happened. Princess Diana died in a tragic accident. Steve Jobs came back to Apple. A movie called Titanic came out. A little-known author named J.K. Rowling released a little book about wizards. We had the first cloned mammal in Dolly the sheep. And there's one other event that's more quiet, but I would argue that it's still important, and that is I was born that year. No, I wasn't. I'm joking. It's actually a book that came out, and I don't know if you've heard about it or not. The author's name is Edwin Friedman. You may or may not know that name. His book was released in 97 by his family posthumously. It was 1 year after his death. The book was called A Failure of Nerve. Many consider it to be the greatest leadership book that we've ever read. And Friedman, if you're not familiar with him, interesting character. He was a Jewish rabbi. He was a licensed therapist, and he was a leading expert on the idea of systems theory. It was the idea that families function like a system. And he applied the data from family systems theory to larger systems, first with synagogues and churches, later with businesses and organizations, and eventually even with nation states. And he became a well sought after expert, an advisor to the White House, other heads of state. And his basic premise was this: in the West, as sociologists have long proven and documented, there is this idea that he called the myth of progress. What Friedman said was when you actually look at the data, just the hard, raw data, the West is progressing economically and technologically. And the economic part could be argued, but this was 30 years ago, and many of his words were prophetic, and boy, do they ring true today. He says more people have more money, or at least a far better standard of living than before. There are these breakthroughs in science and technology and medicine. All of that is at an all-time high, and it's wonderful. and I'm grateful. I'm grateful that I don't have to get on a horse to ride to the grocery store. I'm grateful that because of advances in supply chain, there's such a thing as a grocery store. And I can get in my car and I can go there and I can choose between 39 different types of toothpaste. So, yes, in some areas we have progressed, but what he argued was that based on the data, this is not opinion, this is raw fact. The West is regressing emotionally, morally, spiritually, and socially. In fact, there was a recent Pew survey that just came out over the past year that found that, get this, 39% of Americans say they are more anxious today than they were a year ago. You heard that right, 39%, just compared to a year ago. It's an epidemic, not to mention the stats on mental health, which is going through the roof. SSRIs are a multi-billion-dollar industry now. Chronic depression, bipolar through the roof as well. Every personality disorder is on the rise. Those who identify as having a secure attachment in their relationship is down 25%. Consequently, there's widespread divorce. And what Friedman taught was that there are 5 ways that anxiety spirals out of control. So let me just walk you through them very briefly. Number 1 is reactivity. So this vicious cycle of anxiety is kicked off by a culture of reactivity, where people are constantly reacting to external events and external stimuli with internal anxiety, fear, anger, sometimes outrage, jealousy, whatever it is. This is fed by the 24/7 digital news cycle, and it is amplified and multiplied by social media, both of which thrive off of our reactivity because it generates hits, which drives up revenue. So, in other words, they make money off of our anxiety. They drive revenue from our addiction to our phones. And yes, the vast majority of us are addicted to our phones. And most Americans report anxiety when they can't access their smartphone because the battery's low or there's no signal wherever you are or you can't find your phone. So it begins with reactivity, which leads to what he called a herding, H-E-R-D, herding instinct. Now, in the West, especially in the US, we talk about how individualistic we are. And in the US, we're extra individualistic. But we can't change the nature of what it means to be human. So as the culture is sucked into this reactivity, in spite of all of our talk about being snowflakes and individuals and blah, 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 most of us follow the crowd. And we devolve into a kind of mob mentality about whatever the issue is. That leads to number 3 that he talked about, which is a culture of blame. Rather than taking responsibility in our culture, we have a cancel culture. We point the finger outward and we blame anyone but ourselves. And our blame prevents our healing. Taking responsibility cultivates healing. So in recovery, it could look like this. Addicts blame their partners for being too, quote, controlling. And betrayed partners blame themselves for not being, quote, enough. Maybe he wouldn't have acted out if I was just enough. Blame is being shifted around and nobody wins. That leads to what Friedman called number 4, a quick fix mentality. We live in a culture that's hooked on instant gratification. It doesn't just make life easier for us, but it makes us soft. It makes us impatient, and it makes us afraid of discomfort. We don't know how to sit in anything uncomfortable. So what we chase, even in recovery, is quick fixes. We look for the silver bullet. We live in a culture that treats life like it's an app, that we can just download a fix, update our settings, and boom, problem solved. But life's hard problems, especially in recovery, are not bugs that you can patch overnight. So in recovery, instead of enduring the long, hard work of recovery, we look for a shortcut. We think to ourselves, well, if I just get that 90-day chip, then she should trust me again. Or if I just go to this intensive or read this book or listen to this podcast, my pain will disappear. But the only thing that quick fixes do is they keep us shallow. And it leads to the final thing that he talks about in this cycle of anxiety, and that is it leads to a lack of leadership. What he called well differentiated leadership, which we'll talk about more in a moment. In this environment, you just can't lead. You can't lead well in an environment where there's reactivity and anger and blame shifting and low emotional intelligence and a desire for instant gratification and quick fixes, etc. So in recovery, that means no one steps forward with calmness and clarity. Instead, we're all reacting to each other, and fear runs the show. No one's leading, no one's stopping the cycle, everyone's reacting, and everyone is stuck. Now, this is what Friedman suggested. He said the only way in any kind of system, including our relationship, the only way to stop this self-perpetuating cycle, meaning this cycle won't stop on its own. The only way to stop this cycle, whether it's in your family or in the United States of America, is to inject right into the middle of it what he called a non-anxious presence. And what he meant by a non-anxious presence is someone who is well differentiated. Well, that's a psychological term, but here's what it means. It means it is a person who doesn't get caught up in the emotion of the other person. They are differentiated. They have a clear, healthy sense of a boundary that's between me and this other human. That is your anger, that's your outrage, that's your emotion, that's your fear, that's your anxiety, and I'm not going to make it about me. I'm not going to internalize that. A well-differentiated person steps into the environment of anxiety and he or she is calm. They're not perfect, but they're calm. They're at peace. They're compassionate. They're loving. They're empathetic. In other words, they're able to stop the cycle. Now, Friedman's hope was this: it only takes one person to step in differently to break the whole cycle, but they must have a non-anxious presence to do that. So first, let me tell you what psychology says about this, and then what Scripture says about it, and how can we develop into a non-anxious presence. First, psychology. There's three different fields within psychology that talk about the importance or the impact of a non-anxious presence. The first is called attachment theory. You've probably heard of this before. And attachment theory just talks about we have various attachment styles in our relationships that were developed during our childhood. And attachment theory tells us that safety is created in a relationship, in an attachment, not just by words, but by consistent presence. In other words, if you want your partner to feel safe, you don't have to fix their pain, but you need to stay present with them in it in a non-reactive, non-anxious way. The second area of psychology that touches on non-anxious presence is actually trauma and that field of research. Trauma shows that when someone is triggered because of a traumatic response, their nervous system goes into fight, flight, or freeze. And what calms that system is not logic. It's not arguing with them. It's not trying to convince them with rational thought. It's co-regulation. What that means is this: one person is staying calm enough to help the other person's nervous system return to safety. It's a non-anxious, non-reactive presence. Finally, the field that Friedman was an expert in is systems theory. And systems theory tells us that emotions are actually contagious, like a virus. Anxiety can spread like a wildfire, but so does calmness. So if one person in the system can hold steady, it can de-escalate the entire system. The reason this is possible is because we have something that God gave us, a specific neural cell called mirror neurons. They show up close to the prefrontal cortex. There are a few species that have a high concentration of mirror neurons. Humans, dogs, not so much cats, which explains a lot. Humans, dogs, dolphins, and horses. So it's no accident that these are the species that are often used as emotional support animals because they are trained to remain calm when we are overwhelmed. And because of their mirror neurons and our mirror neurons, we can begin to mirror their emotional state. Their nervous system can regulate our nervous system. Mirror neurons are the reason that a baby can be soothed by the face and gesture and energy and calmness of the parent while they're holding them. So we're all born with mirror neurons. We're all born with this capacity. So that's what psychology says about a non-anxious, non-reactive presence.
At joy-recovery.com, we offer personalized recovery coaching to help you move from pain to purpose. We also provide supportive groups where you can connect with others who truly understand. So, whether you're battling addiction, healing from betrayal, or rebuilding a brand new relationship, you're not alone. We can help. Go to joy-recovery.com today.
Let's look at what Scripture says about it. We're going to turn to a story in Matthew where Jesus offers us a way forward to becoming what Friedman was talking about, a non-anxious present. Or in the language of the Bible, a man or a woman who is free from anxiety and free from fear. So this story in Matthew begins that immediately after this, Jesus insisted. So that's a really strong word in the Greek, in the original language. He didn't give the disciples a choice. He made them get into the boat and cross the Sea of Galilee. They were resistant. They didn't want to do this, but he insisted that his disciples get back into the boat and cross to the other side of the lake. While he sent the crowds, so there's massive crowds there, he's sending them all home. After sending them home and the disciples have left in the boat, he went up into the hills by himself to pray. Now, what I want you to understand, right before this story, just a few chapters before, this was his teaching, this was his guidance when it comes to prayer. This is what he said. When you pray, go away to the, and in the Greek it literally reads, the secret place. So it's a specific place where you are alone, not distracted, no one else around. And pray to your Father in private. Then your Father, who sees everything, including that secret place you're in, he will reward you. Now, I want you to remember this verse because it's going to play a key role in a moment. Jesus had this rhythm of escaping to secret places so that he could be alone with the Father, connect with him, and pray and pray. And he says there is a reward when we do this. So keep that in mind as we continue the story. So understand that the Sea of Galilee that the disciples are crossing right now in this story, it's actually a lake. It's very large, kind of like Lake Tahoe or something like that. It's 13 miles long, it's 8 miles wide. And with the Galilean weather patterns and the way cool air comes off the Mediterranean through the valley, right over the Sea of Galilee, to this day, there are known to be dangerous storms that just pop up unexpected out of the blue. So, understanding that, this is how the story continues. Night fell while he was there alone. Meanwhile, the disciples were in trouble far away from land, for a strong wind had risen and they were fighting heavy waves. So, what should have been about an hour-long row across the lake to where they were going, which was Peter's mom's house for a late supper, is instead now they're in this storm and they're blown way off course. And the story says that it was the fourth watch of the night. What that means is the ancient people used to put the night into four watches, 3-hour increments. The fourth watch that's being referred to here is between 3 and 6 a.m. Now, how many of you are at your emotional best between 3 and 6 a.m.? And you probably had some emotionally charged conversations with your partner that went till those hours, that fourth watch of the night. You're not at your emotional best. So what that means is this: they have been rowing for at least 9 hours in this storm and they're not getting anywhere. And if you back up in the story, they were already exhausted. Here's what happened the day before. They got word of the death of a very close friend of theirs, John the Baptist. And so they go away trying to be alone to grieve and to process and to rest, to heal, to recover from this tragic news. And instead, they're followed by about 20,000 people. And so they end up becoming like waiters at a restaurant, and they're serving meals in this long marathon day to 20,000 people. And so they're like, we've had it. We've got to go. Let's go to Peter's mom's house. She's got the best enchiladas. Now we're just trying to get there, and we're rowing against the wind all night long. 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock, midnight. It's now sometime between 3 and 6 a.m., and they're exhausted. Our story continues. About 3 o'clock in the morning, somewhere between 3 and 6, Jesus came toward them. He's walking on the water. Now, he's not walking near the lake. He's walking on the lake. Okay? He's water skiing without a boat, so to speak. He's walking on the water. And when the disciples saw him walking on the water, they were terrified. And in their fear, they cried out, "It's a ghost." So just a little backstory here. This might be a little weird for us. When we think of going to the lake, we think of an experience where it's a day off and we're camping, we're fishing, it's vacation. It's where we go to relax. But to the ancient Hebrews, the ocean is full of noise and chaos and wind and storms and waves. It's this place associated with anarchy and evil spirits. And there was a first century superstition in that day that the souls of those who drowned in that lake would come out at night and hunt the water, especially if that soul was particularly evil. So as you can imagine, they're scared to death. It's 3 in the morning. They've been up all night. They're deliriously tired. They still haven't processed the grief of the death of their friend. They're stuck in this storm of chaos. And then there's this haunted ghost that starts walking on the water towards them, and they think he's there to kill them. So it's absolutely terrifying for them. Here's what happens next. Jesus spoke to them at once, and he said, "Don't be afraid. Take courage. I am." Now, in some translations, it'll say, "I am here." But when you look at it in the original Greek, he just says, "I am." Matthew, who is the biographer who wrote this story, is a literary genius. He makes this the centerpiece, the fulcrum point of the story. In fact, when you look at it in the original language, there's exactly 90 words before this phrase and 90 words after it. It's like Matthew drew this giant red circle around what Jesus says right here. And he doesn't say, "I am here." He says, "I am," which is the Greek translation of the divine name of God that we get from the book of Exodus. You remember the burning bush story, Moses? When Moses asked, okay, you want me to go set your people free from Egypt, but who are you? What do I call you? Egypt has a lot of gods. They're going to want to know which God are you with? What do I tell them? And from the burning bush, God says, this is my name. I am. And Jesus quotes that. The story goes on to say, Peter called to him, Lord, if that's really you, tell me to come to you, walking on the water. And Jesus said, yes, come. So Peter went over the side of the boat and he walked on the water toward Jesus. But when he saw the strong wind and the waves, he was terrified and he began to sink. Save me, Lord, he shouted. Jesus immediately reached out and grabbed him. You have so little faith, Jesus said. Why did you doubt me? And when they climbed back into the boat, the wind stopped. So let's just take a step back. The disciples were forced to get into a boat that they did not want to get into. Jesus made them do this. There are times when we feel like we are forced or we're made to do something against our will or to do something that is really, really hard. There are times in recovery that we feel like we are giving our best effort and we're making no traction. We are rowing and we're rowing and we're rowing, and it feels like it's impossible. If your journey is anything like my recovery journey and Jacqueline's, there are times when we feel like we are facing what seems impossible. But here's what's easy to miss in this story. In fact, I think it's part of a much larger story, and that is this. God wants to grow you and I into a non-anxious presence in this world. It's the very reason Jesus forced them to get into the boat. He was going to give them a life lesson that they would never forget. And I don't care what your faith background is. I don't care where you are on the spectrum of spiritual maturity or what our program calls spiritual fitness. I would argue that this is something that God is always trying to develop in your life. He wants you to become a non-anxious presence as a result of a deep, abiding dependence on Him. So don't miss this. Jesus didn't step onto the waves because he was just naturally a chill person. And it's not because he had an incredibly calm demeanor. Here was the secret. He had been in the secret place before the storm. He had been with his Father. His non-anxious presence on the water was the fruit of his rootedness in prayer before the storm ever began. That is the reward of spiritual practice. Prayer, meditation, what step 10 talks about. The reward for that is it changes us. Our prayer life with God is not about us convincing God to do something for us. It's about God making us into a new person. That is the reward. That when we go to the secret place and we commune with Him, we leave there different. That's the invitation for the disciples in this story. That's the invitation for you and I. If you want to show up, especially in the storms of recovery, and you are calm and you are grounded and you are a healing presence, you can't do that by willpower. You can't wing it. You can't be driven by your amygdala. We need daily rhythms of spiritual practices, whatever it takes to maintain a quote, conscious contact with God. That's what anchors us before the chaos even comes. I talked to 4 different brothers this week and a couple in recovery. that were talking about storms that they were going through and how overwhelmed they were and how emotions were just all over the place and they felt out of control. And in each of those conversations, I asked them, tell me about your spiritual practice. And there were crickets. What happens is the lower law, and that is when we leave God out, we're overwhelmed. When we leave him out, we're not a non-anxious, non-reactive presence. We leave God out, we're overwhelmed, so we work harder because it's all up to us, which leaves us exhausted, and we eventually either resign, relapse, or go into resentment because our efforts didn't work. What we're talking about is practicing the presence of God. This is a spiritual discipline. This is being mindful of God's presence, that he is as close as the air around me everywhere I go. So if I'm washing dishes, he is a fixed point in my mind. I am practicing his presence. I'm washing these dishes as an act of worship to him. If I'm walking the dog, if I'm cooking a meal, if I'm preparing a PowerPoint presentation for my boss, if I'm having a conversation with my partner, whatever I'm doing, I am cognizant of his presence. Many times before I have a conversation with any of you, or with Jacqueline, or before we start this Zoom call, I will say a quick prayer and just ask God, I invite you into this moment. Help me to hear from you and this other person. Practicing his presence. Our betrayed partners don't need us to be perfect. That's not what they're asking for. They need us to be present. And that presence comes from practice, spiritual practice. The disciples were terrified by the storm, but Jesus was steady because he had just been in the secret place with his Father. If we want to be non-reactive, if we want to be a co-regulating presence for our partner, it will not happen by accident or by trying harder. It comes from deeper surrender. It comes from investing time in a secret place with our higher power. Another way to put it is this: if we want to live like Jesus lived, I need to do what Jesus did. I need to find a secret place, connect with the Father, so that I can be a non-anxious presence like he was in the midst of storms. There's another storm story that happens where he's in a boat with the disciples this time. There's a raging storm and he takes a nap. I love it. A non-anxious presence in the midst of a storm. When we commune with God, when we are connected with God, when we are spiritually fit, we are promised 9 different character traits, 9 different attributes of God that grow and flow through us. The imagery that Jesus used was this: if we abide in the vine, we will bear fruit. The vine is God. If we abide in him, surrender, connect, maintain conscious contact with him, these 9 attributes will be having an upward trend in your life. You will be becoming more loving, more joyful, more peaceful. But look at the last one: self-control. That's the biblical term for a non-anxious, non-reactive presence. It doesn't come by willpower or trying harder. It comes by abiding in the source. And that source produces this for us. We can't manufacture this on our own. We don't have what it takes. We need the character of God growing and flowing through us as we stay connected to him. You can't calm the storm around you, but God can calm the storm inside of you.
That wraps up another episode of Joy Recovery Radio. We hope our conversation today brought you clarity, comfort, or a new perspective on your journey. Remember, healing is possible and you don't have to walk this path alone. To learn more about how we can support you, visit us at joy-recovery.com. There, you'll find information about our individual and couples coaching practice designed to provide tailored support for both addicts and betrayed partners. You can also explore our various online groups, offering safe and confidential spaces for connection, shared experience, and growth. Thank you for joining us today. Until next time, choose joy.